Montana Territory, 1883. The wind came hard across the valley, and it carried the sound of hooves and thundered hearts. Perry Niles stepped down from the stagecoach with a baby on her hip and a boy clutching her skirts, her boots sinking into the mud of Bitter Creek like the place meant to trap her. Her dress was worn thin, her hands chapped raw from the miles behind her, and her eyes held a weight that belonged to someone twice her age. She was 24. She had lost her husband to a fever in Kansas 2 months ago. The land they had tried to tame had turned dry, and the neighbors had turned colder. When the last of the money dried up, the letters to her family in Ohio went unanswered. No one came to help. No one, except the man waiting by the saloon post with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low and a long scar cutting through his left brow. He did not wave, just nodded once. "Is that him?" her son Jacob whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. She looked at the cowboy. He stood still as a tree, lean and tall, his coat dusted from the trail. The horse behind him was saddled and waiting. "Yes," she whispered back. "That is Yates Danner." She had written to him in desperation, though she had not seen him in almost 10 years. Once they had been friends, more than friends, maybe before she left for a better life with a man who had promised her the world. Yates had stayed. She had not looked back until she had nowhere else to go. Yates stepped forward as she approached, his eyes flicking to her children. Jacob was 7 and quiet as snowfall. Little Josie was just 1, her cheeks red from the wind. "You came," he said. "I did." He looked like a man who had not smiled in years. There was something hollow behind his eyes, like he had given too much to the land, to the war before that, to people who had not stayed. "You can stay at the ranch," he said. "I have a spare room. It is not much, but it is dry." She nodded. "We need that." He looked at her for a moment too long, then reached and gently took Josie from her arms. He held her like he had done it before, careful and certain. Josie blinked at him, then curled into his coat. Perry's throat tightened. Jacob stayed close to her side as they followed Yates to the horse. He had a wagon hitched behind it, and he helped her up without a word. The boy climbed into her lap without asking. They rode in silence through the valley. The land was pale and wide, the sky a steel gray that promised snow before long. Bitter Creek was not much more than a few buildings and a church, but the Danner Ranch stood about 10 miles out, tucked against the foothills. The house was small but well kept, a barn to the side. A line of pines behind it. He carried Josie inside without needing to be asked. "You have help?" she asked, stepping into the warmth of the hearth. "No, just me, been that way a while." She watched him move around the kitchen. She remembered how he used to laugh, how he used to talk about building something with his own 2 hands. Now he was quiet, efficient. Like a man who had stopped hoping people would stay, he brought water for washing, set bread on the table, found a shirt for Jacob to sleep in. That night when the children were asleep, she stood by the fire with her arms crossed tight. "You did not have to answer," she said. "I know. I had no right to ask." He looked at her. "You did." She shook her head. "I left you behind." He looked at the fire for a long time. "I never left you." The words settled in her chest like a hand pressed over her heart. "I do not have anything left, Yates," she said softly. "Nothing to offer, no land, no money, just 2 children who are hurt and hungry." He stepped closer. Not touching her, just standing near enough she could feel the warmth of him. "You gave me the only thing I ever wanted," he said. She looked up at him, confused. "You came back." The wind howled outside. Inside, the fire snapped quietly. The next morning, Perry woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Josie was curled in a blanket beside her, and Jacob was already up, his voice low but happy as he talked to Yates by the stove. He had not laughed like that since Kansas. She dressed quickly and stepped out into the main room, surprised to find it already warm, the windows scrubbed clean and breakfast on the table. Yates poured her coffee without asking. "We will need to get you settled," he said. "There is a field behind the barn. I can fence it for a vegetable plot." She blinked. "You mean to keep us here?" "I meant it when I said the room is yours," he said. "As long as you want it." She sat down slowly, wrapping her hands around the mug. Jacob came to sit beside her, leaning against her shoulder. "Mr. Yates said he would teach me about horses," he said. She looked at Yates again. He met her eyes. "You do not have to, I want to." The days passed with a rhythm that felt like something healing. Yates worked the ranch and Jacob followed him like a shadow. Josie took her first steps in the kitchen while Perry cooked stew over the fire. He had not smiled much, but when he did, it was soft and rare and real. One night she stood on the porch, arms folded against the cold. Yates stepped out beside her, the sky wide with stars. "You are good with them," she said. "I wanted them to feel safe." She looked at him. "You have lost someone too," he nodded once. "A long time ago, before the war, she died giving birth. It was a girl, neither made it," her breath caught. "I never told anyone that," he said. She turned toward him. "Why me?" He looked at her then, really looked. "Because even after everything," he said, "you still came back." Her eyes filled and she stepped closer. He did not kiss her, not yet. But he reached up and brushed her hair back, his hand lingering against her cheek. "I thought you had nothing left to give," she whispered. "I did not," he said, "until you walked back into my life." She leaned into his hand, and for the first time in years he let himself feel everything he had buried. The snow came early, softening the edges of the land and blanketing the hills behind the ranch in white. Perry wrapped Josie in layers of flannel and carried her out to the barn where Jacob sat perched on the fence rail, watching Yates shoe a bay mare with steady hands and quiet focus. Snowflakes caught in his hair, melting against the heat of his brow. He didn't speak much when he worked, but Jacob stayed close, asking questions now and then that Yates always answered plain and true. Perry liked the way he spoke to her son, not as if he were tolerating a boy's curiosity, but as though he expected him to grow into a man worth knowing. Inside the barn, the air was warmer, thick with the scent of hay and old wood. The mare flicked her tail and shifted once, but Yates soothed her with a touch to the neck, firm and calming. Perry leaned against the doorframe, Josie settled against her hip, and watched the way his hands moved measured, unhurried, like everything he did was meant to last. "You always this patient?" she asked. He glanced up, brushing his sleeve across his forehead. "With horses, yes. What about people?" He stood and stretched the stiffness from his shoulders. "Depends who they are," she tilted her head. "And me," he looked at her a long moment. "I'm tryin', Perry." She didn't ask what he meant. She could feel it in the way he looked at her these days, like he couldn't quite believe she was real again, but he was determined not to let her vanish this time. Later that evening, they sat around the table. Jacob read aloud from a primer Yates had found in town, stumbling now and then but pushing through. Perry mended a tear in his trousers while Josie gnawed on a biscuit crust in her lap. When Jacob finished the page, Yates slid a piece of paper across the table. "You'll copy that tomorrow." One line at a time, Jacob nodded, proud and serious. "Yes, sir." Perry folded the mended cloth and met Yates' eyes over the boy's head. "He learns quick." "So did you," he said. She frowned, puzzled. "What did I ever learn from you?" He leaned back in his chair, the lamplight settling across his face. "How to let go of bitterness, eventually." She didn't answer. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. The fire popped now and then, and the wind moved soft under the eaves. After the children were tucked into bed, Perry stepped outside to bring in the wash before it froze stiff. Yates was already there, lifting the last shirt from the line. He handed it to her without a word. She folded it over her arm. "You don't have to do everything." "I don't mind." She hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever get tired of being alone out here?" He looked out toward the hills. "Used to, not anymore." She shifted, uncertain. "Why not?" He turned to her then, his voice quiet. "Because you're here." And nothing's felt empty since. Her breath caught in her throat. The cold wrapped around them, but she barely felt it. "I don't know how to be what you need anymore, Yates. I never asked you to be anything but yourself." She stared at the snow-covered earth between them. "You don't know who I am now." He stepped forward, slow and solid. "I know you held your children through hunger and grief. I know you came here with nothing but hope left. That's more than most have." She looked up at him, and for the first time in years, she felt seen without pity. He didn't touch her, not yet, but his voice grew softer. "You don't have to give anything you don't want to, but if you ever feel ready, I'll be here." She nodded once, her throat too tight to speak. When they went back inside, Josie was stirring in her crib. Perry bent to lift her, but Yates was already there, cradling her against his chest. The baby settled with a sigh. Perry watched him carry her to the rocker. He sat, rocking gentle as breath, his hand resting on Josie's back. It was the first time she realized he wasn't just making room for her children. He was letting them into his heart, piece by piece, and maybe, just maybe, he was letting her in too. The January thaw came slow, turning the snow into a crusted glaze over the earth. The nights stayed cold, but the mornings broke with a faint gold light that caught in the hoarfrost and lit the valley in pale fire. Perry was hanging a quilt across the rafters in the spare room when Yates stepped into the doorway, his hat in his hands and something unreadable in his face. "You've got a letter," he said, offering the folded envelope. She wiped her hands on her apron and took it. The handwriting was her brother's, tight, proper, and unmistakable. She opened it with a steady hand, though her stomach had gone hollow. When she finished reading, she set it down on the table without a word. Yates watched her quiet. "They want me to come back," she said finally. "He and his wife said they heard what happened, that they've room now." He didn't move. "They said Jacob could go to the schoolhouse. That Josie would have cousins near her age." Her voice stayed level, but her hands trembled where they rested on the edge of the table. "They didn't write before, not when Thomas passed, not when I sent word from Kansas." "You think they mean it now?" he asked. "I don't know." Yates stepped into the room, the floorboard creaking beneath his boot. "Do you want to go?" She turned to face him. "I don't want to uproot the children again, but if I stayed, it'd be because of you." He didn't flinch at her honesty. Just looked at her like he was weighing something deep. "I've never asked you to stay for me," he said. "I know. But if you did," he went on, "I wouldn't take it for granted." She crossed her arms, more to keep herself steady than anything else. "It's not an easy thing to rebuild after everything's gone. You learn to stop expecting anything good to last. I don't expect you to forget what you've been through." She studied him, the way he stood like he'd weathered storms that hadn't passed through sky. "I found your old saddlebag in the loft," she said. "Had a photograph folded in the bottom." His eyes dropped. "You and the woman," she added gently. "The one you lost. I ain't looked at that picture in years. Why keep it? Because I thought if I let go, I'd lose the last of what I used to feel." She moved toward him, voice low. "And now," he raised his eyes to hers, "now I know it's not about holding on or letting go. It's about making room." The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, a crow called once, then fell silent. She reached for his hand and laced her fingers with his. "I never thought there'd be anything left in me for this," she said. "But every day I'm here, I feel something come back." He didn't answer right away. Just lifted her hand to his chest, pressed it there over the slow, steady beat. "You gave more than you know," he said. "And I didn't think I had anything left to give either, until you walked through that wind with your children and reminded me what it was to feel again." She stepped closer, her forehead brushing against his. His breath was warm against her skin, his hand firm in hers. "I'm not going back," she whispered. "Not to Ohio, not to anything behind me." He leaned his head against hers, voice rough. "Then stay, Perry, build something here with me." She nodded against him. Later that night, after Jacob had drifted to sleep and Josie lay bundled in her crib, Perry folded her shawl over the back of the chair and turned to find Yates in the doorway. He didn't say anything, just opened his arms. She walked into them without hesitation. Not because she feared the past or needed saving from it, but because in his arms she saw what could be made from the wreckage, something steady, something alive, something whole. The creek behind the barn broke free of its ice in late February, water moving slow and dark beneath the thawing banks. Yates had cleared the last of the snow from the pasture gate that morning, and Perry stood with Josie on her hip, watching Jacob toss pebbles into the melt with a concentration that made her ache. He'd grown quieter since Kansas. But it was a different quiet now, one that listened rather than hid. She shifted the baby to her other arm as Yates came up from the shed carrying an old tin box, the top dented and rusted at the corners. He set it on the porch rail between them without a word. "What's that?" she asked. He undid the latch with a careful thumb. "Ledger from my father's time," he said. "Some land filings, receipts. Thought I'd show you what we've got left." Perry set Josie down on the porch boards with a rag doll and leaned over the box. The papers were brittle with age, names written in a hand she didn't recognize, but the last few entries were Yates' steady, plain, and clean. "You own all of this?" she asked, glancing out toward the low hills. He nodded. "Every fence post, but no one's worked the orchard in 5 years. The trees need cutting back. And the cattle, 6 head, 2 calves born last month. I've been trading hides in town, enough to keep us through spring. She ran her hand lightly over the top page. You're showing me this because you think I should have a say. I'm showing you because you already do. She looked up at him, and there was no need for a reply. It was more than trust, it was a place being made for her, not just in his home but in the bones of his life. Later that day, Jacob helped Yates split kindling behind the barn, his sleeves rolled up despite the chill still clinging to the wind. Perry stood nearby, sorting through a crate of cracked crocks and chipped enamel pots Yates had pulled from the root cellar. She found a flour tin near the bottom, lid rusted shut. It took her a full minute to pry it open, and when she did, there were wildflower seeds inside, dry and pale as dust. She brought the tin into the house that evening and set it on the table. "Where'd you find those?" Yates asked as he hung his coat near the stove. "In your cellar, wrapped in oilcloth. Did you mean to plant them?" He nodded once. "They belonged to my mother. She used to grow them out by the well." "They're still good," she said. "If we start them inside, they'll be ready by the time the soil warms." He looked at the small tin like it held more than flowers. "I'd like that." That night, after the children had gone to sleep and the fire dimmed to coals, Perry stood at the table, pressing her thumb into the soft folds of the seed packet. Yates came behind her, his hand brushing her back with the barest pressure. "I was wrong," she said quietly. He didn't move. "About what?" "I thought you had nothing left to give. I thought the grief had taken all of you." He waited. "But you've given me more than I ever thought I'd have again. Not just a roof or a place to stand. You gave me back a future." His fingertips traced the edge of her sleeve. "You gave me my heart back in full when I didn't think it was mine to have any more." She turned and laid her palm against his chest. The heartbeat there was steady, sure. "I want to plant those wildflowers with you," she said. "We will. And I want to wake up here every morning with the sound of the creek and the smell of coffee and your voice telling Jacob to mind the gate." His breath caught. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He bent his head and she leaned into him. The kiss was slow, warm, careful, the kind that settled into the bones and didn't ask to be rushed. When they pulled apart, he brushed her cheek with the back of his hand. "You and the children are mine now," he said. "And I'll carry that every day like it's the best thing I've ever done." She didn't cry. She only nodded, because it was the first time in years she'd felt completely safe. In the morning, she would start the seeds. In spring, she'd plant them with Josie in her lap and Jacob at her side. And through the long Montana summer, they would bloom. By early April, the earth had softened underfoot, and the first green tips of grass were pushing through the thawed ground near the edge of the orchard. Perry tied her hair back with a strip of linen and knelt beside the plot behind the barn, her hands sunk deep in the soil. Jacob worked beside her, quiet but focused, pressing the wildflower seedlings into the tilled rows. Josie sat on a folded blanket nearby, humming to herself as she stacked pine cones in a crooked little tower. Yates walked up from the pasture, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. "That plot's shaping up," he said, brushing dust from his palm. Perry sat back on her heels. "Give it another week and we'll have kale and beets in the ground too." He looked at the neat rows she and Jacob had marked with twine and wooden stakes. "You've got a good eye for it." She wiped her hands on her apron. "It's not just the soil, it's the doing of it. Making something grow again." He didn't answer right away, just stepped closer and knelt beside her. "There's an old beehive box in the loft. My father kept bees when I was young. Thought maybe we could clean it out if you're willing." She glanced at him, surprised. "You'd start that up again." "I would." "With you." The wind picked up, rustling the pines at the edge of the field. Perry reached out and tucked a bit of straw behind her ear. "Then let's do it. I've never worked bees. Might be good to learn." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, they sat on the back step. Josie slept in Perry's lap, her breath slow and even. Jacob sat cross-legged on the porch floor, shaping a bit of twine into knots under Yates' instruction. Perry leaned her head against the porch post. "I used to wonder what it would feel like to stop running." Yates met her eyes without looking away. "And now I know," she said. "It feels like this, like peace." He reached over and brushed a bit of dirt from her jaw. You've changed this place. You let me. Jacob looked up from his knots. Mr. Yates, can I help with the branding next week? Yates nodded. You're ready, I think. We'll start with the colts. Perry glanced at her son, then back at Yates. He's steadier with you. He's got the backbone already. Just needed a place to use it. That night, after the children were tucked into their beds and the fire had burned low, Perry stood at the table, smoothing the folds of a homespun tablecloth she'd finished hemming. Yates came in from the barn, his coat dusted with hay. He took in the quiet room, the soft glow of the oil lamp, then looked at her. I want to ask you something. She turned, setting down the cloth. All right. He stepped closer, his voice low but firm. I've got no silver ring. No preacher lined up, but I've got land and hands to work it, and I've got a heart that's been yours from the start. Her chest tightened. I'd like to make you my wife, Perry, properly, if you'll have me. She didn't hesitate. Yes. His breath left him like he'd been holding it for years. He reached for her and she stepped into him, arms around his middle, her cheek against his shoulder. They stood like that a long time, the fire casting gold across the floor, the wind outside soft and low. 3 Sundays later, they stood beneath the spruce tree by the creek, with a circuit preacher from Miles City reading from the book of Ruth. Jacob held the family Bible, and Josie clapped once when the final amen was spoken. Yates kissed her with both hands steady on her waist, and Perry leaned into him with no doubt left in her. They walked back to the house together, side by side, the children trailing behind, their shadows stretching long across the warming earth. The air smelled of pine and something sweet she couldn't name. Inside, the table was set with cornbread, wild greens, and a roast Yates had traded 2 pelts for. There was no music, only laughter and the scrape of chairs and the familiar, living sound of a home. That night, with the children asleep and the windows open to the scent of early spring, Perry lay beside Yates in the quiet dark. He reached for her hand beneath the quilt, and she laced her fingers through his. I never thought I'd be here again, she whispered. With me, with a full heart. He kissed her temple and drew her closer. You're home now, and you always will be. They fell asleep that way, her head on his chest, his hand over hers, the house holding nothing but warmth and quiet promise. The following months passed in rhythm with the land. Perry tended the garden and learned the bees by touch and patience. Jacob grew strong, his shoulders beginning to square like Yates and his voice deeper by autumn's turn. Josie learned to say her brother's name and chase chickens across the yard with a crooked grin. The wildflowers bloomed late that first summer, but when they did, they filled the space behind the barn with color. Perry stood among them one evening, her apron full of beans, and watched Yates come up from the pasture with Josie in his arms. He stopped when he saw her and smiled, one of those quiet, rare ones that didn't need words. She walked to him, and he kissed her in the shade of the apple tree, their daughter between them, the sun soft along the edge of the sky. Their life was not grand, but it was whole. And for Perry Niles, who had known the long road and the cold miles and the weight of loss, this place, this man, this family, it was everything.